Now see, that's just rude. The poor lady just wanted to pick some flowers and then look what happens. What an asshole. Iridion II, released in 2003 for the Game Boy Advance courtesy of Majesco and Shin-In Multimedia, is a sequel to Iridion 3D, the 2001 launch title third-person rail shooter game that I enjoyed quite a bit. For the second go-around, however, Iridion ditches the stylings of its predecessor and adopts a more traditional vertical scrolling shooter format with a skewed perspective. You ever played that old game Sylphid on the Sega CD? It's similar to that, but confined to a corridor setup that you fly in a straight line while avoiding the occasional obstacle and spray of bullets thrown your way. And while part of me is somewhat disappointed that they didn't follow along the path laid down by Iridion 3D, would have liked to have seen how they could have improved on that 3D aspect with a sequel, the move to a much simpler vertical scrolling format ultimately yields an overall better shooter, albeit one with its own issues. First thing that game lets you do is choose the instrumentation for the in-game music. You can switch around the drums, bass, chords, and lead instruments, each of which has 4 options that you can either go with the same number or mix and match to your heart's content. This isn't something you would see every day, and you know what? I kinda like it. It's not a huge, massive thing that people would notice or even care about, but it's fun to sort of mess around with the instruments and see how the music plays out and all that. And since we're on the subject, Iridion II has some sweet snazzy tunes to its credit. These are some really good smooth listens, the kind you'd kick back to on a nice relaxing day, or a long car ride for that matter. Not sure how any of these fit a shooter environment. None of the tunes seem to exude that tension for those really tense moments. Even the boss music sounds not so thrilling. Beyond that, these are some good tunes that you could somewhat customize to sound somewhat slightly different, and pick the combination of instruments that suit your auditory senses just fine. I also appreciate the fact that at the beginning of each stage, they'll tell you the name of the song that's playing in the background. That's kind of nice, I guess. So yeah, Iridion II is a shmup where you shoot enemies, grab power-ups, can take multiple hits before eventually losing a life, avoid obstacles, and all that fun stuff before you eventually reach the end-level boss, take him down, and move on to the next level. Iridion II mixes things up a bit in that you're traveling to different sectors, and each sector has 3 planets for you to tackle in any order you wish, much like that one game there. Although nothing happens when you beat the level other than points and shit, and once you clear a current sector, you move on to the next sector with another 3 planets for you to tackle, and so on and so forth. The system has also been changed around a bit. You have a main gun that you could hold the A button for rapid fire, double tap the A button and hold to charge your main guns to fire a more powerful blast. You have screen nuking smart bombs you can employ by pressing both the L and R triggers, which are normally used to cycle through your weapon systems. See, you have different weapons that does different things, and you pick a power up, you cycle through which weapon you wish to power up, and you press the B button to power up said weapon. Or if you wish, you could divert power to shields and give yourself a fighting chance. Now if you prefer, you can enable auto upgrade, which upgrades whatever weapon you have currently selected, and that's that. Upgrades come in the form of 2 satellites that will move around your ship unless you're firing, so you can position them slightly by moving around, and this has some effect on your firing range. Or you could just stick with guns that have seeking properties and just focus on dodging shit. That seems to work too. So I'm one of the few people who actually enjoyed Iridion 3D, more so for its technical aspects than its actual gameplay, which is just there. It's not great, it's not bad, it's fairly average, playable fare that I got some enjoyment out of. But by switching to a more traditional vertical scrolling shooter format, Iridion II proves to be the better game out of the two. Plays out as any typical shooter would, pretty easy to pick up and play, even includes a tutorial level to teach you the ropes that you could easily skip over if you don't need that help. I'm not going to complain about how it plays because it plays fine. The controls are tight and responsive, there's multiple levels of difficulty you could play, and the default starter level may come across as a bit easy for some, so be sure to nudge that cursor downwards for a bit more of a challenge. This does have a tendency to be somewhat bullet hellish at times, which I don't particularly care for, but never that far off. For most shooter veterans, this is going to be old familiar hat that they've seen before with a slightly skewed perspective. Once you beat the main story mode, you'll unlock the arcade mode, which is the same game minus the cutscenes. Actually, that's not entirely accurate. Arcade mode is more like a score attack. So with each level you clear, it gets added to the arcade mode, and you basically play the level, try to get a high score, and then you get a special code to send to a website that's long defunct, so just thought I'd add that in there. as well as the challenge mode, aka the boss rush mode that lets you fight all the bosses in one shot, and of course the jukebox, which lets you listen to all those snazzy tracks in the game. But the game has a password system rather than battery backup, which isn't too bad if you're just using the passwords to go to later levels. But I could also find a password online that unlocks all this shit without pulling a trigger, and GameFAQs was a thing back in 2003, so you kinda kill the replay value by implementing a password system that lets you unlock shit from the get-go. Not to mention, why would you lock the jukebox? It's like the best part of the game, quite frankly. Well, the second best part, to be honest. Though the game doesn't do the 3D rail shooter thing anymore, Iridion II doesn't skimp on the visual presentation. You still got those wonderful background graphics, the nice pre-rendered 3D stuff that you're just flying over while you've got these mild interactive objects in the form of obstacles, ships, bosses, things of that nature that look mildly decent by GBA standards. I particularly like this one level with the cloud effects. I thought that was rather cool looking actually. Now mind you, all of this would have looked slightly more impressive on a smaller GBA screen. Playing this on the GameCube via Game Boy Player doesn't quite give off that same visual splendor, but regardless, Iridion II is a pretty nice, sleek-looking shooter for what it was attempting to accomplish on the handheld, and that's to be commended. I've already gushed about the music, which you can listen to once you've unlocked the jukebox, which shouldn't have been locked in the first place, but that's just me. Sound effects are there, they're stock sounds, nothing special really on that front. But again, the ability to customize the instrumentation of the music, I thought that was a neat little gimmick. You don't see that often, and it's a nice little touch to sort of fiddle around with all the instruments and see how the music turns out, which, find a combination you like, it's actually kind of neat. Overall, Iridion II is a perfectly competent and pretty solid shooter that is definitely a step above the original Iridion 3D game in terms of the gameplay, though much like that first game, once you get past the visual splendor and the sweet melodies of supposed war, the core gameplay isn't anything really special. It'll be a fun time while it lasts, it's solid for the most part, but it's also nothing you haven't seen before in other more noteworthy shooters. Still, if you enjoy shooters, or you enjoy games that push the Game Boy Advance to its technical limits without completely shitting the bed, Iridion II might be worth a shot, though be warned, this one commands a much higher price than the first game. Not quite premium pricing unless you're looking for a boxed copy, but this isn't going to be cheap if you're looking to add this to your GBA collection. Now on a side note, both Iridion games were eventually released onto Steam, and they're just GBA ROMs running off an emulator with some minimal options at most, including save states, which should be a bit of a selling point. That's an option you could go for if you want to try these out, and for less than $20 you can get both games, so it's essentially a smarter deal money-wise. Just know that what works on a smaller GBA screen doesn't necessarily work when blown up to modern HD standards, and honestly, I'm sure you could find much better shmups on Steam anyway, so yeah, that's all there really is, really.